Our scripture lesson today is from John chapter 11 with various parts being pulled out. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. After having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to him, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus had delivered in him, and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. Holy wisdom, holy word.
Where do you sit in this story? In this story from the Gospel of John, who holds your voice? Does your voice intermingle with Mary's? Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Her voice drips with grief-filled honesty and, frankly, such disappointment. Lord, if only you had been here. And she knew who Jesus was as well as anyone did. She knew he had the power to heal, to make whole, to inspire, to give life. She knew his presence might have changed the whole situation. She trusted him. She believed in him. She loved him. And because of all that, Mary could not understand why Jesus had not been there to make everything okay. In an earlier scene in this story, we learned that Jesus knew about Lazarus' illness several days before Jesus decided to show up. So Mary could not figure out why Jesus had not come when he was first summoned. Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. I think about Mary's voice when I hear about the violence in our nation. I think about her voice when I watch the evening news and see tragedy upon tragedy. I thought about Mary's voice this week when I saw the reports and pictures of stepped-up attacks on Ukraine. And I can easily imagine Mary's grief-soaked, honest cry on the lips of many women and men and children who keep watching those they love be injured and killed in those violent attacks. Lord, if only you had been here, my mother, my father, my child, my sister, my brother would not have died. Do you find your voice in those families? In Mary kneeling at Jesus' feet, grief-soaked and disappointed? Or maybe, perhaps, you find kinship with Martha's voice. In her typically bold style, Martha lays it all out there for Jesus. Unlike the grief-soaked tones of Mary's voice, Martha's has a sharp, angry edge to it. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. In other words, you messed up, Jesus, but you have the power to fix it. So do it. Martha, like Mary, knew Jesus very well. And she also trusted him, believed in him, loved him. And that is precisely why she was angry. Martha felt betrayed. So she walked right up to him, stood up straight, looked Jesus in the eyes, and said exactly what she was feeling. Lord, if only you had been here. I've heard Martha's voice too. I've heard Martha's voice echoing in the words of a former parishioner whose young adult son was using meth. This mother felt as if she were stuck in a dark, deep hole, powerless to do anything about it. Her son had gone to rehab a few times, only to come home and begin using meth again. Lord, if only you had been here, this woman would utter again and again. Her son, a boy who had grown up in the church, been active in our Sunday school program, our youth group, had gone on mission trips. This beloved son of hers was sinking lower and lower into addiction as she fought for his life. And she was furious with God about it. She had always trusted God, believed in God, and loved God. Therefore, she was angry that all of that faith had not protected her son from so much pain. So in my pastor's office, she regularly stated what she felt. Lord, if only you had been here, my son would be okay. Do you find your voice with that mother and with Martha, desiring to look Jesus eye to eye, sharp-edged and rightfully angry? Or maybe your voice is one of those in the crowd, the voices who wondered loudly why this Jesus, who had opened the eyes of a blind man, could not have prevented Lazarus' death. If this Jesus, who he was really who he said he was, then Lazarus didn't need to die, yet Lazarus did. And perhaps all of this Jesus Messiah stuff was just a sham, just one more person's attempt to get power and control. If he is Lord, the skeptics murmured, then Lazarus shouldn't be dead. Jesus is just another con artist. I've heard those voices from the crowd too. I have friends whose voices would fit in with the crowd's questions. They are wonderful, good-hearted, deeply loving people who have been turned out and burned by the church so many times that they simply find it too hard to see anything good in it anymore. They are friends whose hearts have been broken by people they thought were church family. Women and men who hear the church folk talk about love and unity and justice, but then see the church folk act with pettiness and self-interest and judgment, or not act at all. Karen, one once said to me, I cannot understand why you are involved in the irrelevant and hypocritical institution of the church. There are plenty of other places where you can find spiritual community. Their voices would have fit right in with the skeptical voices of the crowd that day outside of Lazarus' tomb. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Do you find your voice with my friends and those in the crowd, skeptical or cynical? And what about the voices of the disciples? Does your voice blend with theirs? Their voices rang out loudly and clearly before Jesus even made a move toward Lazarus' grave. Jesus and the disciples had just narrowly escaped being stoned to death in Jerusalem by those angry with Jesus' claims of being the Messiah. And fearing for their lives, they had all gone across the Jordan to safety. But then, a couple of days after Jesus heard about Lazarus, he told his disciples that it was time to go back to Judea. Are you kidding? The disciples asked. Rabbi, we were just there and they tried to stone you, and you're going to go there again? The disciples' voices were full of fear. Maybe Jesus had forgotten what it felt like to be frozen by fear, but they had not forgotten. They had not forgotten what it felt like to hear the religious leaders plotting to arrest Jesus for his ministry. They had not forgotten what it was like to be on guard 24/7, wary of shadows, unable to breathe deeply. Lord, if you go there, if we go there, have you ever heard a voice so constricted by fear that you had to catch your breath? I think about some of the voices I once heard in Oregon when our session decided to have congregational conversations over whether or not to allow same-sex marriage ceremonies in our sanctuary. The session was completely on board with the decision to allow it. So my colleague and I really thought that most of the congregation was too. It did not appear to be a controversial decision on the surface because we had already had members who disagreed with the denomination's decision to let each church decide for itself whether or not they would allow it, walk away, and pull their membership from our congregation. Thus, I was completely caught off guard by the reaction of a few in our Christian community. You want to do what in our sanctuary? You want to let same-sex marriage happen in our holy space? And as a staff in session, we knew much of this reaction was fueled by fear of others who were different in some ways, but really not different much at all. Yet that fear had such dominance in those few voices that it had squeezed out all of the love and compassion in them, leaving no room for anything else. Lord, if you go there, if we go there, just between you and God, would your voice blend in with the fear-filled voices of the disciples? People who loved Jesus the best they could, but who could not support his decision to constantly be vulnerable for the sake of others? Where is your voice in this story? Who holds it? Does it rest with Mary? Martha? Those in the crowd? The disciples? Maybe you hear your voice in the mouths of each of them from time to time, depending on the day and depending on the season of life you are in. Of course, there's one voice we haven't considered yet, and I'm not talking about Jesus. I'm talking about Lazarus. Lazarus, the one to whom and with whom all of this happens. Did you notice that he doesn't speak at all in this story? Lazarus has no words at all in this interaction. And as a matter of fact, after he comes out of that tomb and is unbound by his community, Lazarus drops out of the scene and is never mentioned again. We have no record of what he thought about this whole experience. We do not know if he was joyful to get another shot at life here with us, or if he was upset because that meant that he was going to have to one day die again. We have no knowledge if Lazarus ever went on to preach or to teach after his experience of being a living, breathing miracle. All we know about Lazarus is that Jesus called him out of the tomb, and he came out, was unbound, and let go. Perhaps John did not let us hear Lazarus' voice because Lazarus indeed said nothing. But what if John did not let us hear Lazarus' voice because he wanted us to imagine what Lazarus' testimony might be? Once he had been unbound and let go, what might he have said? Perhaps Lazarus might have said to Mary, "I hear your voice, and all I can say is that through this Jesus, God knows what it is like to weep. God's heart is always the first to be broken. But try to trust that one day your tears will be dried and weeping will be a memory. Keep using the compassion you've been given." And then perhaps Lazarus might have said to Martha, "Sister, I hear your voice, and I hope you can trust that through this Jesus, God knows your anger, and God will not let injustice or illness or even death have the last word. So continue to lift your head and stand tall. Keep using the voice that you've been given." Maybe Lazarus would have said to those in the crowd, "Friends, I hear your voices, but I also know that through this Jesus, God is creating the church, but it is also going to be made up of people like you and me. And so that means it's going to be messy and sometimes really messed up. Nevertheless, God is still going to choose to work in it and through it for the healing of the world. But you continue to challenge it and keep it honest. You too have a part to play in God's work. And then perhaps Lazarus would have turned and said to the disciples, "Brothers, I hear your voices, but through this Jesus, God has put flesh and blood on Be Not Afraid. So take a deep breath. Have courage. Keep holding on to each other too, for discipleship requires community. You can borrow strength from each other." These responses are, of course, just imaginative guesses. We don't know for sure what Lazarus' voice would have sounded like or what he might have said. But because he is silent, we can all wonder about his testimony. Wonder what our testimony would be if we were like Lazarus. What would we say if during the season of Lent, we tried to open our ears to hear Jesus call our names? How would we respond to Jesus' summons to come out of whatever it is that keeps us bound and entombed in our own lives? Because friends, that's what happens each and every day. Each and every day, as we sit in our own captivity, whether that captivity be to grief or to anger, captivity to cynicism or to fear, captivity to just plain numbness or to our constant busyness, captivity to a whole host of other powers that try and lock us down. As we sit in our own captivity, Jesus stands outside those tombs and calls our names. "Come on out," Jesus cries to us. "Be unbound and let go." Each and every day of our lives, Jesus invites us to come out of the depths of whatever is keeping us captive so that we might walk into the light of a new start, a new life, a kind of resurrection here and now. This season of Lent offers us the time to honestly consider what is keeping us bound, keeping us from rising and being set free, keeping us from letting go. This week, I read a blog post in which the author said the following: "This Lent feels not like something that must be done, but something that can and should be done. A great deal of muck has stuck on my shoes this past season that I'm eager to scrape off with a big Lenten stick. Outrage, anxiety, even despair. I need a season to drop some of that stuff. So much accrues, obligations and habits and grudges and attitudes. Lent is an invitation to walk for a season without some of those things by making a habit of dropping them by the roadside." Or, as Lazarus might put it, Lent is an invitation to get honest at what is keeping us bound and locked in our own tombs, so that we too will hear our names being called as Jesus summons us to freedom. Freedom not just for ourselves, but freedom to act for others as well. After all, the story of the rising of Lazarus is not just a story about Lazarus. It is also the story about our own rising in Jesus. It's the story, our story, about a new life that can begin today and not just after we die or we are placed in our graves. Maybe that's why John kept Lazarus silent. Maybe he kept him silent so that we might stand in for him and be his voice of new life and freedom. And maybe, as members of Lazarus's extended family, that is the voice that we can claim today on this third Sunday of Lent. For that is the voice that we all need to hear. Come out, Jesus cries. Be unbound and let go. Rise up. Rise up. Amen.